gamers? Power Heal here, and today we're going to be talking about the Naxx Priest Healing BiS. So I know I've been gone quite a bit, but I wasn't going to leave you guys without some Naxx content. So we have the BiS list coming out, and then we're also going to talk about how to do Naxx, and we'll probably do a video on the mind control as well, because I know a lot of people have been asking about that. But right now, though, we'll just kind of hop into this video, and we're going to do it the same way that we did the other BiS videos for AQ40, which is where we talk less about the other options in a relative sense, and we're kind of just listing out the actual BiS. We're going to talk about the other options in the sense that we're going to compare the items and show you why it's better individually, but we're not going to talk about budget items in this particular video. That's going to be for like a realistic BiS video, and that'll be coming out basically probably like right after this one. So if that's more your thing, keep an eye out. I recommend probably looking into that one, as you're not going to be able to get all BiS items in most cases. One of the things about Naxx, though, is that with how the tier tokens work, it tends to be easier to get your tier, especially if you're like a priest on Horde side. And a lot of the good pieces, or at least pieces that could be pretty good, right, even if they aren't BiS, they're like almost BiS equivalent, are tier pieces. So you should be able to get a lot of good gear out of Naxx. There's also just a lot of gear in Naxx in general. So in some ways, Naxx kind of goes against the grain in terms of loot scarcity, as there's just a lot of loot in here. And with tier tokens, it helps the loot in terms of how it's distributed, right? It helps it be distributed a bit better amongst the raid. So just some things to keep in mind before we kind of go into these styles of videos. But we will start with the helm here. The tier 3 helm, and this is just better in my opinion than the Lost Hat. I think this is even better at this point than the Crystal Adorned Crown, because you're giving up so much MP5. Well, I guess not really that much, but I think that this is like arguably better. It's even if you want to argue that Crystal Adorned is better, that's fine, but they're very equivalent. Right, and you're squeezing, I would say, at least an extra like 6 MP5-ish out of this, potentially 7, and that makes it worth it for me. It also gives you access to set bonuses, which I'll talk about at the end of the video, how much I value them. The long and the short of that is that the first 2 definitely are not, terrible. They're kind of situational, but they're not terrible. So having access to them is never a bad thing. And when the gear comp is this close, then it's pretty clear that you want to go with the tier. Now, comparing it to the hat here, this hat doesn't have spirit is the main difference. So when you add the spirit component onto the circlet here, you basically have like a 9-ish MP5, right? And so you're only missing 2 MP5, and you're gaining like 10 more healing, is it? Yeah. 11 more healing, and then you're gaining a little bit more healing on top of that, because you're gaining like 5 more if you're deep holy, right, from the spirit value here. So it's really more like 80 healing. So I think I'm pretty confident in saying that this is pretty much BiS, just in terms of like the best individual item, and in a relative sense against your tier 2, it's a big upgrade over your tier 2. And the reason why we're talking about tier 2 is because you'll notice we still have tier 2 on this video. And I know I said I'll talk about the set bonuses later, but it's probably good to just get into that now, I guess. Because this is such an important thing to talk about with gearing and priest, is that 3-piece tier 2 is still the best thing you can have. So no matter what, you want 3-piece tier 2 in your loadout. It doesn't matter if you have the right pieces here. You just have to make that work, and we'll talk about that in more detail in like the the almost BiS video. But the long and the short of it is that for the 8-piece here, this epiphany thing where it increases your mana regeneration by 24, it's just not going to be, even if you have this up 100% of the time, which I believe the uptime is very high on this, you could pretty much have it up, when you're in combat casting, up 100% most of the time. Still, it's not going to be better than the priest 3-piece, right? So it's better off to just use the 3-piece. And, people might make the argument, well, they're like, well, why not just use full tier 3, right? Because you really need mana regeneration at this point in the game. And the answer, in my opinion, would be you need mana regeneration in Naxx more than ever, basically, right? And even if you're a guild that just comes in, completely destroys all the Naxx bosses, then you're still going to want mana regen for doing Naxx faster, right? Because you can basically, just have less downtime if you have more regen. So it's never worth giving up the incredibly small amount of healing you get from, using the last 3 BiS pieces instead of the pieces of, in terms of individual healing, right? Over the tier 3 pieces that you're going to use, because you're just giving up so much regen for barely any healing. Hi Della, just doing a Naxx video here, so but nice to see you in the stream. So next thing we want to talk about here is the amulet. So this is by far the best amulet. I think that in a scenario where you need to use every last drop of mana, right, the intellect from these amulets become a bit better. So if your first time progging Saf or something like that, right, and it's going to maybe come down to the last heal, then you actually are going to see some value from the intellect in both of these pieces. They may let you get 1 or 2 heals off that you wouldn't otherwise be able to, right? Whether that be something like a renew, right? You can actually do a ton of healing with the extra intellect from these pieces using low rank renews, right? So if you're really on the last of your fuel and you have to get a little bit more healing out, having that little bit extra intellect can actually go a long way in terms of casting a couple redos. Because remember, even if you have something like a rank 4 renew, right, that's still going to do a lot at a high healing gear level against something like Saffron's frost ticking aura. It's basically going to be I think 400 a tick-ish. So even if you get 200 healing or something back per tick to counteract that, it's still going to be enough to kind of carry you. So I always mention intellect in the case of you're probably not really going to use intellect that much because it's really kind of a stat for are we getting down to the last few heals on a boss? And that's mostly not relevant, right, for a lot of bosses that you've kind of encountered so far. But in Naxx, it definitely could be relevant for quite a few people. So using something like Angelus's Charm, especially because you're probably going to have this for the last tier, is pretty good for a while, right? But this will ultimately be the thing that you kind of want to eventually acquire. Now, I know I said we're not going to do too many crazy off comparisons here, right, in terms of budget BiS or anything like that. But in this particular case, Amulet of the Shifting Sands from AQ40, you get it from the head of Asarion. It's so easy to get, and it's basically the same item as Amulet of the Fallen God, right? So in these really obvious situations, I am going to mention it even in the BiS video because I want people to be aware if they only watch one video. Basically just get this amulet from AQ40 and you basically have a BiS a neck, right? So not much different from that, but that is the technical BiS. Going on to the shoulders. So these shoulders are just strictly better than all the other shoulders. As you can see, they basically have stats on them, so it's not even a case of the Lost Hat here. They have stats, and the item you're comparing them to from AQ also has stats, but this just has more healing and more mana per 5, and basically equivalent or the same stats. As you can see, it has a little bit more spirit, right? So these are just better. And they're quite a bit better than the tier 2, and we're going to be talking at the end of the video about why we chose the tier 2 pieces that we did to use in this set, but you can see that already it's a substantial upgrade from tier 2. So going into the cloak, this is technically the BiS cloak, but it's very close to something like Cloak of Clarity, right? You can see that if we do the calculations here, we're basically at 7 mana per 5 on this cloak, and then you have to basically add 1 mana per 5 here, so it's 7 versus 9, and then you have 8 more healing on this and around in the same intellect, right? You could even make an argument that if you're going to do something like high-end speedrunning, you would rather have Cloak of Clarity just because it has stamina on it, right? Just the chance that you don't, if you take a little bit of extra damage, you have a better chance of living. I could totally see that argument. And it does have a little bit more regen on it as well, and you're only trading 8 healing. So just very, very close options here. If you already have Cloak of Clarity, definitely not something you're gonna be looking to go for. But I have to mention it as BiS. Robes of Faith. So this item is it's kind of like the Helm, where it's very similar to Robes of the Guardian Saint, right? Robes of the Guardian Saint don't have Spirit on them, so you're basically getting an extra, 4 healing from this, right? Or 5 healing, sorry. Yeah, 5. So you're basically like 69 healing, and then you have another 4 MP5 from the Spirit-ish, right? So you're basically at like 9 MP5, so it's a slight upgrade in terms of MP5, basically the same healing, a little bit more intellect, and it's going to give you access to either the 2 or the 4 set, so that's why we use this over Guardian Saint, but again, very similar, as you can see, to Robes of the Guardian Saint, if you have those from AQ40. So it might not be in a rush to upgrade. Now, here we have Bindings of Transcendence. Now, this obviously isn't going to be the best individual item. As you can see, both of these items are better, right? But we're using this as part of our Tier 3 because basically what we want to do with Tier 3 is take items that are like, you're going to see the least difference in, right? Now, typically that tends to be these items like the wrists, boots, gloves, stuff like that. In this particular case, boots are an exception to the rule. But a lot of times those item slots that you think don't matter as much, don't have as many stats on them, are the better items to use a lower tier set in, right? Because you're losing less stats overall in a relative sense by using those over the other items. So that's basically why we're using Trans here. As you can see, it's very similar healing to these two, and they all have very similar stats. Obviously, Bindings of Faith are a bit stat heavy, but even when you look at that, right, Bindings of Faith being stat heavy, they pretty much have the same intellect and same spirit as the Bindings of Transcendence, right? So you're really losing almost nothing. This means that basically the Bindings of Faith were really bad, right? And if you were to try to use like any other item, you would basically want to use Braces of Royal Redemption from AQ40. But these versus these, it's like a really terrible comparison, right? Because you're only dropping like 1 spirit, and then you're gaining 2 intellect and a little bit of extra healing, so totally not worth it there. So definitely worth using the Bindings of Transcendence. Now the weapon's going to be interesting. So technically, we're going to go over these first, then we'll talk about ATS. Okay, so outside of ATS, this is by far the best hammer, right? The best combination. The hammer itself is just leagues better than any other one hand, right? It's not even close. We can even compare it to some of the 2 hands, right? You can see it has more healing on it than a staff, which is crazy. It's way better than the False Prophet hammer, even, not really comparable to anything. And then when you get into the offhand, things are a lot closer, right? So the right Eye of Saffron here is, a little bit better than Satura's Might, right? And it's not even that much different from Noth's Heart here, because there's no spirit on this. So keep in mind that you're going to get, it's going to be like 53, what is it going to be, 53 healing, something like, or 56 healing, something like that, when it all comes out. And it's going to be, approximately 3 MP5, maybe a little bit less. So you have very, very similar item here, right? And very similar item to this as well. And even if you look at something like the AV offhand, which is incredibly easy to get, you have very, very similar item, right? Basically the same, you're just missing a little bit of intellect. Again, in Naxx, the intellect can matter more, so it can be nice to have, but still, it's ultimately, when you consider an item you can get from just getting AV Exalted, and you could have got this phases ago, right, and you compare it to Saffron's Right Eye, it's just not really that great of an item. So yeah, don't worry about that too much. Now, let's go to ATS, right? Now you can see immediately, wait, hold on, is this, okay, I just want to make sure this is correct. Yeah, okay, this is the right one. It's automatically showing us the Priest one. So basically, the 27 Spirit that goes into, we don't have any spirit on the other two combos, right? So 25% of that is basically going to be like, like six healing. So it's pretty irrelevant. But you're also going to have the 300 healing from the staff itself, right? And then you're going to have the 62 healing, which you benefit from the party members. I believe you benefit from this as well. So especially if you're in a group with other healers, this is a pretty good staff. Now, some considerations to make with this, right? If you're an alliance priest, you tend to be put more in the melee groups, okay? So this bonus effect is kind of going to be completely wasted, right? Whereas if you're a horde priest, you tend to get put with other casters, right? Now, this is only healing, so if you have a priest with ATS, you would want them to be in like a group with maybe, a shaman that doesn't have a place in a melee group because you have extra shaman. You want them in a group with the other priests, the druid probably. And if you put the priest with ATS in that group, you're getting quite a bit of value, have an extra 60 healing on everybody, right? It's nothing crazy, but when you consider that the staff itself has 360 healing for you, right, which is just, better. So if you combine the two, the hammer and the offhand here, you see you get 300 healing there. So it's 300 healing and 12 MP5 you're basically going against, right? And you have more intellect than the two items combined. And you're going to basically end up with like 5 MP5. So you're comparing 12 MP5 to 5 MP5. But then you have an additional 62 healing. Again, it's a little bit more than that when you factor in the spirit, right? Probably like 67 healing, 68 healing. So it's a pretty big gap over the combination, and ATS is definitely the technical BiS, but it's just going to be incredibly hard to get, right? And most of the time on Alliance side, you're definitely not getting ATS. On Horde side, there's a better argument. Mages are always going to have prio on this item if you want to be like, what is the most impactful thing for your raid, right? But, I mean, realistically, mages are also, even in Naxx, people always, they get like really excited about mages and Naxx, right? They're like, oh, ignite and, crit, really good. And the thing is that, like, because if you don't know, ATS gives 2% crit, I believe, to all party members, including the mage that's wielding it, which is very strong. But mages in general, still not really that strong in Naxx, right? Mostly there for the AoE. If you look at the Ignite, like everybody raves about the Ignite, go look at like the Ignite of a speedrunning guild, okay? It's probably, I think it's like, literally I did the calculation now, it's like 1 point something % of the total raid damage, right? Which is fine, but it's not anything to write home about. Like, it's not going to be, like, your mage having ATS versus him not having ATS, you're not even going to notice the difference in the raid as a whole. He might notice the difference. The mages overall might notice the difference in their performance and parses relative to other mages, but in terms of the raid performance as a whole, you're not going to notice anything. Now, by the same token, you're not going to notice anything with a priest having the additional healing from the ATS and all the healers having the additional healing from that either, right? So it goes both ways there. Basically, what I'm saying is just give this, if you're on Horde, I would say just give it to whoever is like, you think has put in a lot of effort and deserves a nice special reward, right? Don't really try and min-max it too much. On Alliance, it makes a bit more sense not to give it to Priest because the whole extra effect is just getting completely wasted. But yeah, on Horde, it can be decent to give to a Priest. Now, moving on to the gloves. We're using the tier gloves here. Now, it's interesting because if you see me do a bunch of like videos for BiS, right, and from all the different tiers ever since these gloves became available, and you notice I'm not very high on these gloves, right? But the reason why we're using them here is just because, again, in a relative sense of what you're giving up, there's not that many great options in the glove slot, right? So let's pop open the glove slot. And Gloves of Faith, they're okay, right? But nothing too crazy, really, right? You're gaining like, 5 MP5 when you do the math out. And then Gloves of the Messiah, gaining a lot more MP5 here, but the healing's kind of low. Remember, we kind of did the comparison last video where Gloves of the Messiah, Gloves of Dark Wisdom, and Gloves of Prophecy are very similar gloves. Because when you do the math out, the MP5 is very equivalent, and in this case of Gloves of Dark Wisdom, you're basically trading MP5 for a little bit more healing, right? So these two gloves are almost virtually identical, and then the Gloves of Dark Wisdom, you're just trading MP5 for healing, and all these gloves are pretty comparable, like to this, like Gloves of Dark Wisdom. Like, are you really thinking you're gaining a ton more upgrading from these to Gloves of Faith? Not really, right? Gloves of the Messiah, you really gaining a ton more. You're gaining like 15 healing, not that much, right? And we're not even factoring in the crit percentage. Now, crit, not like really the best stat on a healer, but it is something. It's going to affect your throughput over the course of a raid by a very small amount. But again, so is 15 healing going to affect your throughput over the course of the raid by a very small amount? Because remember, 15 healing is not even getting passed through the spell coefficient yet. So by the time that gets to something like a flash heal, it's more like 7 healing, 6 point something healing. So in reality, at least crit doesn't have that issue, right? Where it's not hit by any type of spell coefficient or anything like that. You're just getting the straight value if it actually does happen to make your spell crit for that instance, if it's the difference maker, right? So these gloves are pretty good in a relative sense because we need the 3-piece, and now the other slots are more competitive, right? So with the other slots being more competitive, we have to pick an upgrade or pick an item here that there's not very much difference between it and the best gloves you could possibly have. So that's why I make the decision with Gloves of Transcendence here. And that's why they come back into the mix, back into the fold, essentially. Now, Grasp of the Old God here, this is kind of like a no-brainer. It's just by far the best belt in the game. Not even really that close. This is like, you're losing 4 MP5 and 11 healing. It's not like the end of the world if you don't have this. Of course, like at the end of the day, all these values are still relatively small. But if we're talking like a 1-for-1 item comparison, this is obviously just better than any other belt. So that's why we go Grasp of the Old God. Now, Leggings of Transcendence. This is a very interesting piece, right? Because let's compare it to Legs of Faith, okay? And we'll see what you guys think. So, we're losing 20 healing off the rip. That's the obvious thing you see, right? We're not super concerned about stamina, right? And we're only losing 5 intellect, and we're losing about 7 spirit, okay? So, since we're losing 7 spirit, what we can basically do is subtract 1 mana per 5 from the Leggings of Transcendence, and you could think of Leggings of Faith as like a Leggings of Transcendence with like 1 MP5, right? And they have 20 more healing. So you're basically sacking 20 healing for 6 MP5. I don't even think that's a good trade. I'm not going to lie. I would take the MP5 all day there. So I almost think that even Leggings of Transcendence are a better individual item than Leggings of Faith, believe it or not. Granted, the thing that you're kind of typically comparing them against for some people would be Empowered Leggings, right? These are the things that people like to compare them against. But in this particular case, I do just value the MP5 over the crit. Right now, again, like it's kind of it's kind of wishy-washy there. It doesn't really matter that much. But the whole point of it doesn't really matter that much is kind of a reason why you wouldn't even want to bother with these, and why I haven't really been preaching to go after these for priests for the entire duration of the game, right? Because you're basically taking something away from somebody else, which they could use really well. So Paladins, for example, on Alliance side, Druid on Horde side, right? To give yourself something that's not even really a significant upgrade over your legs, right? If at all. So I think personally Leggings of Transcendence here just by far the best. And you get them in Molten Core, they stay BiS for the entire game. Really nice. And we'll kind of move on to the next option here, which is the boots. So boots, boots is a slot. This is probably a slot where a lot of people might use trans boots, right? Because they don't have boots of pure thought. If you don't have boots of pure thought, trans boots are, not that bad when compared to Sandals of Faith. Obviously, you're losing the MP5, but you're only gaining like 10 healing from using these over the other boots. So it really just depends on what you want to do there. Again, depending on the availability, depending on what people in your raid want for tier 3, you can mix and match a lot of this stuff, and you're not really going to get that much difference, right? But I'm just trying to give you like my theoretical, if I could have everything I wanted, what I would use. So in this particular case, I would use the Pure Thought over these, but these are not bad by any means. And to be honest, like you could make the argument for sure that you would rather have the bit of extra intellect on these, right? And the MP5. So even if we're not talking about replacing this with like a tier 2 set piece or something like that, you could just say that, well, even if I have Boots of Pure Thought, I actually just like Sandals of the Faith better. I think that that's a perfectly acceptable argument, right? You're only losing like 18 healing, basically, and you're trading 18 healing for 6 MP5. Again, I actually, kind of while I'm doing this live, I actually think I like the Sandals of Faith better than Boots of Pure Thought. I'm going to be completely honest with you guys. I don't think I would, if I had Boots of Pure Thought, I wouldn't be in a rush to upgrade, but I actually think that these are a bit better. So I might swap this in. That's actually funny. We had a change of heart doing it live. You notice here I have 5 Spirit on these. You're probably better off to just put the move speed enchant on them, especially in Naxx, because it's definitely going to be likely that you lose world buffs, unlike in some of the other raids. I just didn't have it here because obviously if you have full world buffs, you have the ZG movement speed, which triumphs over the Boots movement speed. But yeah, I mean, in a lot of cases, you're probably not going to have that because if you're in like a middling guild, you're going to be wiping, so you want the movement speed on Boots. Coming down to the rings here. So Ring of the Martyr and Ring of Faith. Now, you could basically swap like any of these, I would say, top 4 rings around. It really doesn't matter, okay? Band of Unanswered Prayers is a great ring. It's basically like 3 MP5 version of Ring of the Martyr. You could definitely make a case that you would, in some particular fights, you would maybe rather have the intellect than the mana per 5. You'd have to do the math out in certain cases, right? But I think Ring of Faith is a very solid option because it helps you contribute towards the set bonuses, which we'll, again, talk about at the end. Also, it's 3 MP5 easily, right? A good chunk of intellect, and it has, like, the most healing, right? And then I think... But I think, again, like, MP5 is kind of, like, really the thing you want to go for here, so that's why I have the MP5 over the intellect, and why I have Ring of the Martyrs technically being the best ring. Pure Momentum Band is, again, really good, right? Because it's basically like the other rings, except you're just losing 1 MP5. Instead of getting 3, you're getting 2, right? 3, you get 3 MP5 here, getting 2 MP5 here. Basically the same stats, basically the same healing. Just all really fantastic rings, so it doesn't really matter which ring slot you get, but I would say these are probably the 2 BiS rings for sure. Going into the trinkets. So trinkets are interesting, right? So I would keep Rejuve Gem as your constant, okay? And then I would just rotate other trinkets. The most effective thing you can do, probably in terms of individual items, is rotating trinkets. So, have an Eye of the Dead, have a what do you call it? The item from ZG, the Hero Charm, right? Use the Hero Charm. You can even use the Priest. I don't know if it's in here. But yeah, use the Priest. Prayer Beads. You could use even the UBRS trinket, that gives the bunch of healing and the bunch of because that one's on a super short cooldown. I think that one's here somewhere. Where is it? Yeah, this is the other one I was talking about, the Greater Heal Charm from ZG. Yeah, this is... It doesn't actually tell you the cooldown. I think it's like 1 minute, 15 seconds, though. It's kind of powerful. So that's really good. The Scarab Brooch is good. Basically, I have like the Brooch, the ZG Heart, and the ZG... I finally got the ZG Greater Heal Trinket because I stopped being lazy. Hibernation Crystal is also amazing if you have it. But yeah, you basically just rotate these, right, in the other slot. And if you need to have a dead slot, Eye of the Dead is a better option, right, because it does have passive healing all the time, right? So you want this one kind of back in your dead slot if all of them are on cooldown, right? And this is an interesting option for fights in particular, right, because I think this is probably the best trinket you're going to use when you're going into, like, an encounter, if that makes sense. Because you're getting the flat value all the time, and you can't swap trinkets out during the encounter. So on Trash, you're getting a lot of value from swapping from one trinket to the next, right? It doesn't make sense to keep Eye of the Dead in, even with a 70 healing. But if you were to get Eye of the Dead, on an encounter-by-encounter basis, it's nice because you're locked into that trinket for the entire fight, so you're still getting the 70 healing, and the effect is obviously really powerful. And you're probably only going to be able to use, like, one effect anyway, right? So it's not like the exception is maybe if you had, like, the UBRS trinket, you could use it multiple times a fight, right? Or something like that, something with a really, really short cooldown. But most of these trinkets you're using once a fight anyway. So you have an incredibly powerful effect on Eye of the Dead here, as well as just the flat healing. So that's why I have this in the secondary BiS slot, because I think this is something that it's really great on Priest. People rave about it on Druid because there's a thing with Rejuve where you can basically snapshot the 450 healing because Rejuve doesn't count as like a next 5 spell or whatever. So you can basically use 4 spells, right, and then just spam Rejuves until the 30 seconds is up. Now, you can do the same thing, I believe, on Priest with Renew. It's just that on Priest, your job tends to be not to just spam Renew, right? So that's why I think people think of it more of a Druid item, because Druid is kind of just like you're putting up Fairy Fire and then you can do whatever you want, is kind of the thought process there. You're not really expecting your Druid to do something in particular, and yeah, snapshotting a bunch of Rejuves with an extra 450 healing power is pretty strong. Right, so I think that's where people's mind goes there. But you can do the same thing on Priest, and in particular, if you have one Priest that has this trinket or something like that, or a couple, they can do crazy work on a fight like Sapphiron, doing that strategy, right? So they can basically do the Druid role on Sapphiron from the Priest perspective. So if you have an extra Priest or Priest that don't need to be healing a tank, or don't need to be POHing a specific group or something like that, you can basically make use of the same effect. So it's still a very good trinket on Priest, even though people are going to want to say Druid trinket, right? It's a very strong trinket on Priest. The Wand. So the Wand is interesting because it's definitely BiS, I would say, when you compare it to the other wands, right? So this is the next best wand, I would say. And you're basically getting 2 MP5 from the Whispering Dead. You're getting more intellect and more healing. It's probably better overall. They're very similar, though, right? So all these wands, I would say, I would even include this one in, right? Like, again, like, very, very similar wand. That, like, all these are incredibly similar. The thing is that the reason why you might want to grab this is if you, like, solo farm Dark Runes or something like that, this wand is a massive jump, even over something like Essence Gatherer, let alone something like Antenna of Invigoration or Eternal Light. So it's literally like double the DPS, more than double of Eternal Light. It's, substantially more than Invigoration and substantially more than even Essence Gatherer, right? So this is going to be a crazy wand if you want a wand that is technically an upgrade for healing and just does a ton of damage out in the open world. And it even is Shadow, so it benefits from... if you go Shadow spec to farm runes or something like that, which now it's very easy to do, right? Because you have dual spec. This is incredibly potent out in the open world. And I think, is this the kill? Okay, is this the KT one? There's a wand from KT. So this is the only one that's going to be better for doing something like that. But obviously mages and stuff are going to want this. So most people are probably not going to want to take this over mages. But this wand is actually cracked to have as a Shadow Priest. It just does a ton of damage. And yeah, so it could be something you might want to use as well. But it's definitely not the best healing wand. Right. So that is basically the BiS list. Oh, we're going to talk about the set bonuses on the tier, right? Because we mentioned we would do that. So personally, I think it's worth getting the first 4, right? So the first 2, I guess. But which means you need 4 pieces of gear from the Faith set, the tier 3 set. Because even though you may not be using Greater Heal a ton, you are going to be using it with the ZG Trinket. And there will be fights that you might use it, like Patchwork or something like that. Dungeoning, you would use it. You might use it in PvP. There's tons of places you could definitely use Greater Heal, and having the extra 500 Absorb is just really strong, right? It's not bad at all, and you're going to have reasonable crit as long as you're world buffed. So especially when you're world buffed, this set bonus it's not trivial. I don't think it's the greatest thing ever. You're still going to be using a lot of Flash Heal in Naxx, right? That's not really going to change, but definitely better to have than not to have it when you consider that there's basically no cost of, having it, right? Because the items tend to be better anyway. Like, you're going to want 4 pieces of the tier 3 set almost irregardless. So you might as well, like, if there's a close comparison in your mind between a tier 3 item and a non-tier 3 item, and the tier 3 item is going to get you the set bonus, you might as well just take it, right? You might as well just take it, grab the set bonus. That's how I feel about it. Now, the 2 set, you're probably going to just, like I said, have this by default, because if you're going to go for the 4 set, you're going to have the 2 set. The 2 set is pretty good. It can be good on, fights like Saffron, potentially, if you're using Renew on Saffron. It's really good in dungeons. Obviously, it's really good in PvP. It can be good in world PvP, even personally. Right, so just having 12% is a pretty substantial amount on your renew, so it saves you quite a bit of mana. And as we've talked about many times on the channel, I'm not the biggest fan of HOTS, but when they are useful, they can be really useful, right? And there are some fights in Naxx where they are quite useful, like Menexia and Saf and stuff like that. So it's just a good set bonus. Nothing crazy, but it's good and it's worth picking up. The 6th set, just not really worth it in my opinion. Like I said, the 8th set is just strictly worse than the 3-piece of tier 2. So yeah, that is basically the BiS, and we will be doing the almost BiS next. So thank you guys so much for watching. Hope this helps you, and we'll talk to you guys next time.